Super Tuesday is in the books with sweeping wins of all contests by Joe Biden and a crushing performance by former President Donald Trump, who won every contest except for Vermont. With a rematch of the 2020 election all but certain, Biden and Trump also won big in Minnesota. But Minnesota voters also sent clear warning signs to both candidates.
Now, this is Talking Points on CBS News Minnesota.
Good evening and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Esme Murphy. Nikki Haley has suspended her campaign after losing every Super Tuesday state but one. Haley did not endorse former President Trump. Minnesota Congressman Dean Phillips also suspended his campaign without winning a single delegate. But Phillips did endorse Joe Biden. Former President Trump now stands on the verge of clinching the Republican nomination. With 1,215 delegates needed to win, he has over 1,000. Nikki Haley has collected just 89 delegates. Donald Trump won at least 26 delegates from Minnesota, and Nikki Haley won 12. In a warning sign for Trump, nearly 30% of Minnesota voters cast ballots for Haley, knowing full well she wouldn't win the nomination. In Minnesota, Biden won 70% of the vote, but Minnesota Democrats also sent a warning sign. 19% of Minnesota Democrats voted uncommitted, a protest vote against Biden's handling of the Israel-Hamas war. Just 8% voted for Minnesota Congressman Dean Phillips. With 1,968 delegates needed to win the nomination, Joe Biden is well on his way with about 1,548 delegates. Biden won 64 delegates from Minnesota, and Uncommitted won 11 Minnesota delegates. Let's begin our analysis with Hamline Law Professor David Schultz. Well, joining us right now, Professor David Schultz of Hamline University, also a constitutional law professor. Thanks so much for coming on.
My pleasure, Esme. Thanks for having me.
All right, your hot take on Super Tuesday here in Minnesota.
Minnesota looks like it's now in play as a swing state again. And the reason why I say that is that with 19% of the vote going for uncommitted for Joe Biden, the Democratic primary, this potentially changes the equation in terms of how Minnesota has looked in terms of maybe 2024. Remember, in 2016, Trump got close, but didn't win Minnesota. Biden does better. But now, with Trump saying he really wants to win Minnesota, and there's this dissatisfaction in the Democratic Party for Biden, I expect we're going to see this state being a competitive state, or at least the candidates will be here this time.
Interesting. Yeah, 2016 really was a shocker. Minnesota was not called for several days until after the election. And Trump lost in Minnesota, but barely by 50,000 votes. Now, 4 years later, in 2020, it was a much more decisive win by Joe Biden, by the Democrats. But that set the scare, 2016, into Democrats. And you think that actually could be on the horizon again.
I do. But even if Minnesota is truly not a competitive state, Democrats have to win Minnesota. This is sort of one they have to have in their bank. And if they have to put time and resources into the state, that means less time and resources in what? Wisconsin or Michigan as two other Midwest states, or perhaps less time in Arizona, Pennsylvania, or Georgia. So to me, if you think of it in terms of finite time and resources, Democrats have to actually worry about winning Minnesota now. And that changes their calculus for the 2024 presidential election.
And that means diverting money and people and resources from other states, like
exactly.
Our friends in Wisconsin.
Right. But it also means what we're going to probably see is, since Minnesota and Wisconsin are both in play, look to see probably significant ad buys in the Twin Cities, maybe up in Duluth, because they're going to get both states.
All right, and I'm sure the ad department here at WCCO TV will be thrilled with that, because it didn't look like we were in play, that all that money will be diverted to other states. But I think you're absolutely right. I think it's going to be really interesting to see. On the Republican side, your thoughts about all those people going to vote for Nikki Haley, more than 30% here in Minnesota. That's a lot, knowing that she wasn't going to win the nomination. Now she's out, or she's going to be out of the race. Where do those voters end up?
Well, that's a good point, because Trump has his 60 or 70%, but he's got a 30 to 40% defection across the country at this point. And for many of those voters, they are, to use that phrase, they're never Trumpers. I don't see them going and voting for Trump in the general election. I don't know if they're going to vote for Biden, and that's going to be really the big question here. Where do they go? Do they stay home on election day? The people who didn't vote for Trump, do they vote for Biden? Do they maybe consider a third-party candidate? Because we do have several third-party candidates on the ballot, including, Robert Kennedy Jr. So I think that's going to be curious to see. I also want to see what Nikki Haley does in the next few days in terms of, does she eventually come around and endorse Donald Trump? Does she not? Where does she position herself? And I think that might give us some clues
Right.
also to where perhaps maybe some of those voters are.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting because I went to the Nikki Haley event that she had in Bloomington a week before Super Tuesday, and talking to voters there. I didn't talk to everyone. There was more than 1,000 people there, but I did talk to a number of them, and they were all saying the same thing. They are conservatives, and they said, we are not voting for Donald Trump, which is, and they said, we're all certainly not voting for Joe Biden. So I don't know if they look for a third party candidate. The thing with third party candidates, it looks like not all of them will be on every state ballot, but could this be an election year where those third party candidates could swing some key states?
I think it could. We could be looking at something that's kind of a repeat of Florida 2000, where the appearance of Ralph Nader on the ballot there certainly affected the outcome of the race there, and then, of course, nationwide. And if we've got third party candidates located on those critical swing states, again, like the Arizonas, Georgias, the Wisconsins, Michigans, Pennsylvanias, and maybe Minnesota. Even before this results last night, I was saying 150,000 voters are going to probably determine the presidential election in these swing states. I think what these individuals do in these few states could really affect the outcome of the election.
Right, and for those who are friends who are younger and don't really remember
Right.
2000, that race was won with the state of Florida. There was a recount, and it was 500 plus vote differential between George Bush and Al Gore, and the Supreme Court basically decided the election for George Bush, halting the recount there. And just quickly here, the Supreme Court could do it again, couldn't they? With key rulings, a key ruling coming up on Trump.
That's right, because we're expecting a ruling in the next 2 to 3 months on whether Trump has any immunity from prosecution from events surrounding January 6th. But even beyond that ruling, there's also going to be the case opening up in New York later in March regarding payoffs to Stormy Daniels. And there's also the potential cases in Georgia and in Florida, which are not going to be affected by that Supreme Court ruling. So look to see a lot of court cases that could impact what's going to happen in the 2024 election.
All right. Well, David Schultz, as always, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Coming up, the breakdown from our two political analysts, Democrat Abou Amara and Republican Amy Koch. It's an interview we taped just before Nikki Haley and Dean Phillips suspended their campaigns. And I'm here with Abou Amara, our Democratic analyst, and of course, Amy Koch, Republican analyst. Super Tuesday is in the books, folks. Let's break it down. Let's start with the Democrats, because to me, the biggest surprise was, yes, Joe Biden won. That wasn't a surprise, but Uncommitted coming in with a solid 20-something%. Your thoughts about that?
Well, Joe Biden today showed he is clearly going to be the nominee, and also showed if he doesn't do some significant work between now and Election Day, that may cost him the election. The uncommitted vote may cost him re-election.
Right. Your take on what happened on the Republican side?
All right. Well, obviously, strong night for former President Donald Trump. You can't deny it. He also will be the Republican nominee. But just as the uncommitteds were the sort of surprise of the night, Nikki Haley coming in with 30%, actually winning in Vermont. Some bad news in the cards as well for Donald Trump. And what is he going to do with those Republicans? And can he bring them home?
Well, where are those Nikki Haley Republicans going? Who are they going to vote for in the general election?
It'll be a mix, right? Some will vote for Biden. Some will vote for sort of an undetermined, and some will vote for Trump. So it's just a matter of, like, can you offset that loss? Does Biden lose the uncommitted in more numbers? Because I don't think the uncommitted are going for Trump, right? I don't think the uncommitted go for Trump. They stay home.
Right.
It's the question of, with those Nikki voters, how do they divide out?
Yeah. The amazing thing, going back to the uncommitted, Abou, is just that I just got a text from somebody who was involved in that campaign who said they organized for a week,
yeah,
and that their goal was 5,000. I mean, talk about blowing away expectations. I mean, they really got more than they wanted. I mean, this goes beyond just Muslim voters. This is progressives. This is young people. This is black voters.
That's right.
How does Joe Biden get through this?
Yeah, this issue has really galvanized really the core constituencies of the Democratic Party: African Americans, young people, immigrant voters. If that group of voters do not turn out in high numbers in critical swing states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada, there isn't a path through the Electoral College for Joe Biden to win.
All right. Earlier we talked about a CBS News poll that shows that 85% of Republicans are planning to vote in the general election. 75% of Democrats are. A serious enthusiasm gap. I mean, Republicans have to be looking at their chops over that.
So frankly, it bodes well for former President Trump, but it also bodes well for Republicans in the down ballot. And that is also something to be aware of, with the U.S. Senate up for grabs, and here in Minnesota having the Minnesota House up for grabs. I think that the down ballot for Republicans could benefit at this moment. Of course, we're a ways from the election, and lots can happen.
Well, okay, Amy's talking down ballot. I mean, there seems to be an enthusiasm gap right now. I mean, we're a long way away from the general election, but an enthusiasm gap on the Democratic side. Is Joe Biden the person who's going to have any kind of coattails?
Well, there's no question the CBS numbers show that there's an enthusiasm gap, but I will tell you, a person that galvanizes Democrats well is Donald Trump. And so as we get closer to Election Day, lots of Democrats are going to say, wait a minute, the choice is between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. I have to turn out, and I think that will crystallize the choice in November.
All right. One of the things that we've talked about is just that here they are barreling towards the nominations, both of them, and yet there is so much uncertainty here. In terms of Trump, you're an attorney. I mean, are all the legal problems just sort of blowing your mind? I mean, how would you even begin to deal with that as a client?
Well, I think, Donald Trump has actually done an effective job, and I hate to give him credit for this, of using the law to advance his political agenda. And so by delays, by pointing out other issues, distracting, and then utilizing it to bring his voters together, he's actually turned the courtroom onto the campaign trail and got voters as a result of it.
Well, and frankly, the Democrats have overstepped on this, right? The lawsuit that came forward in Colorado that was the Supreme Court just decided on, by the way, 9-0, right? It seemed like a ham-fisted attempt to just keep them off the ballot, and I think there's an innate sense of unfairness that plays into what the former president talks about, which is they're after me, and if they can get through me, they're coming for you.
All right. Listen, we're going to take a quick break. We will be right back with Abou and Amy. And we're back here with Abou Amara, Democratic analyst, Republican Amy Koch. In terms of, this thing that we're talking about, the fact that there's so much uncertainty, what are most Republicans really thinking? Do they really think that Donald Trump is going to be there in November with all these trials and everything like that? I mean, they have to be concerned, even those loyal Trump supporters.
Oh, I mean, I think that what Republicans say behind closed doors to each other doesn't necessarily match their public rhetoric. Again, I would say the same thing for Democrats, right? These are two candidates that are pretty wildly unpopular even within their own ranks, or at least not popular. And so, but Republicans in the end tend to kind of come together and pull together and toe the party line. Versus the Democrats can sometimes, have a little more difficult keeping all their eggs in that one basket.
All right. Abou, Joe Biden, deeply, deeply unpopular, yet some of his supporters say they don't understand why.
There's no question he has an agenda to sell. The problem is it has not been resonating based on the numbers we've seen. The fundamental question for Democrats is going to be, is this going to be like 2016 where you have an established Democratic figure who loses to Donald Trump, or will this be an energetic base of people that turn out to defeat Donald Trump? That's the question of the 2024 election.
Right. Obviously, Dean Phillips, if there was one place he was going to get any delegates, it was here, and he didn't cut it. He didn't get to 15%. Is his future over?
Well, the fact that he lost to Uncommitted, I think, is an indication of the level of support he has in the state. I suspect this may be the end of his political career.
Wow. Going forward, when we look at this election, Donald Trump versus Joe Biden, is there a possibility that just millions of people will sit out?
Well, absolutely. That's a very distinct
Or
possibility.
are we waiting
Yes.
for a third-party candidate to emerge? And I mean, that's I guess what we're all going to be looking at is a third-party candidate.
You know, that's sort of always been kind of lurking in the background, right? Is that something that's going to come forward? And I think that as these primaries commence and as you start to see these numbers, if you start to see 20% for the uncommitteds in the Democrat Party and you continue to see 30% or so for Nikki Haley, you know, someone might get the idea that, boy, there is a sentiment, and polls show over and over, there's some sentiment by Americans that we're not happy with either of these choices.
Right.
And generally speaking, if a third-party candidate gets in, remember, 2016, Jill Stein pulled tens of thousands of votes that would have gone to Hillary Clinton, allowing Donald Trump to win. Third parties get in, it generally speaking is going to help Donald Trump.
What about the fact that all the polls now indicate in these swing states that Donald Trump is solidly ahead?
Right. I mean, I just think there's no, like, the Democrats can say what they want, but the poll numbers have been in Trump's favor and moving in the wrong direction for Democrats, moving in the right direction for Trump for the last 2 months.
And growing for Trump.
And that's what I'm saying. The momentum is on Trump's side. It's growing in not just the general election vote, but in the swing states. And that is true. And how is Joe Biden going to get out there and campaign? It is not possible. You can't imagine it's possible. And I don't think surrogates are going to cut it. I don't think it's going to be enough, because in 2020 that was all right, because people weren't really campaigning and it was COVID.
Right.
It's a whole different story in 2024.
Right, and he wasn't when Joe Biden came to Duluth. He did not do interviews with local reporters. He didn't really go out and mingle with people. But nobody mingled because it was COVID.
Yeah.
I mean, he's not going to get that pass this time around.
I do think that's a component of the campaign we need to see much more of. I would say within the last year, Joe Biden has been focused on his day job and not doing enough connecting across the country. I suspect we'll see some changes moving forward.
All right. Bottom line, what's your takeaway from this Super Tuesday for Minnesota?
My takeaway is that...
And across the nation.
My takeaway is that you have two clear frontrunners who are going to be their nominees, who have fundamental flaws in their candidacies. Whoever is better able to answer their flaw will be the next president.
That makes sense?
I think it makes complete sense. I think that's it. Are those uncommitteds and those Nikki Haley voters, which side can bring them home first?
Uncommitted will have a few delegates from Minnesota. Uncommitted will be going to the convention this summer. Unbelievable stuff. All right. Amy Koch, Abou, Amara, thank you so much. Really appreciate your insights.
Thanks for having us.
And that does it for this edition of Talking Points. The show streams every Wednesday and Thursday night at 6:30 and 9:30 p.m. On Fridays, we post to YouTube for on-demand viewing. As always, please send me any comments or suggestions at esme@wcco.com. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Esme Murphy, WCCO News.